All right, how's it going? So I'm going to start giving you some of these video lectures for each of the different families that we're going to study. And that way, when we get into the classroom, then we can spend all our time looking at specimens and figuring out how we're going to identify them and things like that. So since this is the first one, I want to briefly talk to you about the specimens that come out of my collection. They're all going to be in alcohol. So that's fairly benign. It's much easier on you than formalin, but you need to watch open cuts in your hands. I like to wear a pair of gloves just for that reason. They're not particularly anything you need to worry about there other than open cuts, but of course make sure you wash your hands really well afterwards. Try to not let the specimens dry out. So if they sit there for a long time, the fins get dry and brittle and start to break, and the specimens deteriorate. As I said, make sure you wash your hands really well afterward. When you put the fish back, I need to also forgot to mention here, please make sure you're putting them back in the correct jar. If you put them back in the wrong jar with a non-matching label, then that really causes a lot of confusion to other students later on. Okay, any instruments that you use, please clean them, put them back in the proper spot. That includes mostly the dissecting pans that we're going to be using. And before you leave, make sure you wipe down your table. Let's keep everything nice and clean. Okay, well that's when we're looking at the specimens. Now let's start talking about different families. And we always start with the lampreys, Petromyzontidae. And you'll recall from our last discussion or our discussion on fish taxonomy, we have two superclasses, Anatha and Gnathostomata. Anatha are the jawless fish, Gnathostomata are the fish with jaws. So the lampreys are jawless, they're in the Anatha. And I've shown you some pictures. Here's another picture of one. This was a parasitic lamprey that someone pulled off a paddlefish. And you can see that it doesn't have any jaws. It has this oral disc. Well, why do they look so different than other fish? When you think of fish in your brain, you don't think of a lamprey. Well, this group has been around for hundreds of millions of years. They split off with the bony fish a long time ago, and they don't have jaws. And so they're their own very unique lineage, but they still are fish. They're no closer to other fishes than we are to other fishes. That's how long ago they split off, and I showed you that graphic earlier. Are they eels or related to eels? They're related to eels because they're both fish, but they are not eels. Eels have a similar shape, but eels have jaws. They also have paired fins. So it's pretty easy to recognize an eel from a lamprey. So because they are such a different fish, they have a little bit different life history than what we're used to. The larval stage are called Ammocetes, and then those will spend years until they metamorphosize into the adult stage. The larvae don't have that oral disc. They have kind of a hooded mouth, which we'll show you here in a second, and it's real soft. And so they just sit and filter the bottom ooze, and they just suck up sediment and remove invertebrates from that sediment, and they don't really have any eyes to speak of. When they decide to metamorphosize, they turn into adults, and then they get that oral disc. It's also called the buccal funnel, and that's sort of a characteristic of the adult life stage. And here's a larval lamprey. And you can see it doesn't have that oral disc. It's got kind of a hooded, soft mouth. And from the side, you see there's no eyes here, and you've got several gill openings, but that soft mouth versus the adult mouth, which is a hard disc and sometimes has these rasping teeth inside. So big picture, in here in Kentucky, we have basically two groups of lampreys. We've got the parasitic lampreys and we've got the Brook Lampreys, or the non-parasitic. So those non-parasitic lampreys you don't find them on the sides of fish. The adults don't really feed. They just spawn and they die. So they're sort of like mayflies. They just exist long enough to spawn, and most of the life stage is spent in that larval life stage. Now the parasitic ones, these are the ones that are very noticeable because you'll find them attached to other bony fish. And so they attach using that oral disc, they rasp a hole in the side of the fish, and then they feast on that fish's blood. And I've shown you this picture, and here it is again. And so this is what it looks like. Now, anecdotally, whenever I hear of these being on fish, a lot of times I hear it of them being on, like, this is a lake trout or a paddlefish, things that have very small scales. And I wonder if that is because it's easier for them to get a hole in those scales. But you don't ever really see them on catfish. You know, they don't have scales. But maybe they need some scales to hold on to. I don't know. This is all completely anecdotal evidence. And occasionally a fisherman will pull a fish out of Kentucky Lake with a parasitic lamprey attached to it. And here's another picture. And again, this is just in somebody's aquarium, so that fish is, or that lamprey is attacking a much smaller fish. It reminds me of the brain slugs in Futurama. Now in Lake Michigan, they have sea lampreys, all right? Well, how did sea lampreys get into freshwater Lake Michigan? They came through the Welland Canal. The Welland Canal was dug so that ships could get past Niagara Falls. And this consequently connected the rest of the downstream systems and all the Great Lakes, basically connected them to the ocean. And this is how shipping can get in and out and all the way to Chicago, but that also brings along a lot of invasive species like the sea lamprey. And so these are a huge problem in Lake Michigan. They parasitize the lake trout, which is, I showed you a picture of that. They parasitize other native species. They've had a dramatic impact on the native fish fauna in the Great Lakes, in Lake Michigan. And so if you look, here's where the Welland Canal is, and you see how that connects the St. Lawrence River. Well, I mean, it was always connected, but you had the Niagara Falls there, which would keep organisms from traveling through either system. I'm guessing organisms could travel downstream a little easier than they could go upstream, but with the shipping, that starts to bring in a lot of these invasive species. Now, sea lampreys are what we call diadromous. So here's a term that you need to know. Diadromous, di meaning two, means they live in two types of water. They can live in salt water and in fresh water. So that's why they're sea lampreys, but they can also survive in freshwater Lake Michigan. Now, within diadromous, we can break that down into two types. First, we have anadromous, and that's when the adults live and grow in the sea, in the ocean, and then they ascend streams, go up streams to spawn, and usually die. And the young start out life in the freshwater and then move to salt water. The opposite of this is catadromous. And catadromous are fish that where the adults spend most of their time in freshwater, then they migrate to saltwater to spawn and die. The young fish start off in saltwater, but then move into freshwater. The way I remember these is that the anadromous fish ascend streams to spawn. And so typically, this is a more typical pattern. More fish are anadromous than catadromous. And this is what we think of when we think of, say, salmon going on a run. They spend most of their life in saltwater, then they ascend streams to spawn and die. That's anadromous. And so all lampreys do this. All lampreys are anadromous, and they ascend streams to spawn. Well, they take advantage of this to kill the sea lamprey in the Great Lakes. There's a lampricide called TFM that you can drip into the streams that kills the larvae. And so this is one way that they manage and try to control the sea lampreys in Lake Michigan, is they know they have a choke point. They know all those fish are going to go up into the streams to spawn, and so that's where they try and kill them. Use this TFM to kill the larval lampreys. Another way to get rid of lampreys is to catch them and sell them. They're considered a delicacy in Europe, about 25 bucks a pound, and I don't even know how old this slide is. Obviously, there is not a lot of interest in lampreys here in the United States. We don't eat a lot of fish here in the United States, though. In Kentucky, we've got about 7 species of lamprey, and we have both the parasitic and the non-parasitic. The way we tell those groups apart is we look for a notch in the dorsal fin. And if it has that notch, it's going to be one of the Brook Lampreys. And those are in the genus Lampetra, which means stone sucker. And so they probably are seen, sucking algae and things off of stones. That's where they got the genus name from. And so here's a picture of least Brook Lamprey, and this is the notch. And it's not much of a notch, but it's still a notch. Again, you see the mouth here is poorly developed. Most of these Brook Lampreys, like we said, the adults just spawn and die. They don't go and parasitize, so they don't really have a need for a very well-developed mouth. But that notch in the dorsal fin will tell you if it's a Brook Lamprey or Parasitic Lamprey. If they don't have that notch, they're parasitic. They're in the Ichthyomyzon genus. And a good example of that is this one I showed you here. This is the chestnut lamprey. Now, when we're trying to figure out what species of parasitic lamprey we have, we're going to look at the teeth and the inner ring of the mouth. All right. The circumoral teeth is what we're going to call those. And so do some of those teeth on that inner ring have 2 points? They don't all have to have 2 points, but if at least some of them have 2 points, that's going to be a chestnut lamprey. And if none of those teeth on that inner ring have 2 points, then it's probably going to be a silver lamprey. And you notice we're not looking at the ones here at the top of the mouth. We're looking at the ones sort of on the side, the circumoral ones. That's where we're trying to decide, do they have 1 point or 2 points? 1 point is a silver lamprey, 2 points is a chestnut lamprey. All right, and so that is it for the lampreys. We're going to go ahead and jump to the next family here pretty soon, but let me know if you got any questions. Thanks.